It's time now for the news review of this bulletin. The UK is gearing up for more strikes as workers from various sectors express their frustration at low wages. Border Force workers and railway staff have already gone on a strike in a move that the government admits is causing massive disruptions for passengers, shoppers, and commuters. Border Force workers say that they will stay off the job until New Year's Eve. Military personnel and other civil servants are now having to cover for striking workers at airports. Nurses and ambulance drivers are also planning further industrial action in January. Workers are demanding higher pay in keeping with the country's soaring inflation. The UK's Prime Minister has already voiced his opposition to wage increases, saying that it will stoke inflation. The UK is witnessing a decades-high inflation rate, which has led to a cost of living crisis in the country. Said Poor is our correspondent joining us from London. Also from London, Rodney Shakespeare, Professor of Economics, joins us for a breakdown. Welcome to you both. Said, first over to you. Tell us more about the strikes and any upcoming ones and where things stand regarding them.
The strikes, Kaveh, this countrywide industrial action has been a fixture of the UK throughout 2022. And what was referred to before as the summer of discontent is now turned into a winter of discontent, with more of those strikes planned for the coming month. The railway strikes, NHS, the healthcare workers, and teachers even have planned strikes for January. Some of those, of course, have already been held. The railway workers as well as NHS workers, as we have seen over the past few weeks and months, have already been on strike, and more of those are planned for January, as I say. And the reason it's gotten here, to quote Pat Cullen of the Royal College of Nursing, has been government intransigence. The government, as you say, has been resisting calls for inflation matching pay rises in some conditions for these workers who have had no other reason, were left with no other options, as they would say, other than taking industrial action. Inflation, as you know, is in the double digits. 11.1 is the recent figure, expected to go even higher, whereas the government is offering somewhere around 5% in most cases to a lot of these workers, and that is nowhere near that amount to match the inflation. And these are people who, some of the people I've talked to over the past few months would tell you that they haven't had a raise for a long time. And this, of course, on the back of 10 years of austerity under the conservative government, the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and that other very important elephant in the room, hence the situation the country it is in now. And it looks like there is no end in sight as far as these strikes are concerned, unless and until the government comes around to agreeing to the demands of these many and varied industrial sectors who have been taking action to get their demands met. What the government has also, of course, been doing at the same time is try and whip up public resentment against these industrial actions, such as people in the NHS, for example, ambulance workers, talking about how people walking off their jobs, will impact care for the patients who need them, especially in the run-up to Christmas, which is past that now, and of course to the new year, and also railway workers as well. But they are standing put. They're staying put. They're saying that they will continue walking out their jobs, although they understand the public frustration over it all. But they will have to continue doing this until and unless their demands are met. And public support for them is still high, despite the fact that, as I said, the government has been trying to turn the tide against these strikers. And so we're going to see more of that definitely in January and beyond, unless they get around the negotiating table and come to an agreement, which will be a win-win for both parties. As far as the NHS, for example, the nurses in Scotland who didn't go on strike last time round because last-minute negotiations had gotten underway, they have already rejected a pay offer from the government there, and they will be joining the rest of the NHS
What was that pay
workers
offer from the government?
in the next.
What was the pay offer from the government? Do you recall?
Again, it's always more or less around 5 or 8%, nothing beyond that. Whereas, as we know, the NHS workers have been asking for 17%, and
Okay.
that has faced fierce opposition from the government here
All right.
and in the developed nations.
Rodney Shakespeare, so we're not going to get into the discussion of how this affects the UK economy, but the more important question, which has been kind of the flavor of what our guest, Said Purza, has been saying, is that what is the government going to do about it when it comes to government employees, for example? And overall, is there a solution on the horizon when you're looking at, again, as Said said, they're asking for 17% in some sectors, and yet the government offer is somewhere between 5 and 7%.
Well, the 17% request is, of course, much nearer the actual reality of the inflation figures. I mean, they're different for different people, for which they're experiencing. And we are beginning to move towards a situation like in 1975, where there was 25% inflation and 15% interest rates. But the real extraordinary thing is that there is a big factor in this, a massive factor causing into the inflation. And nobody is talking about it. Not the Conservatives, not the Labour, not the Liberals, not the Scottish Nationalists. It is the eastward movement of NATO towards the east. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis 60 years ago when the Americans refused to have missiles right next to them. And here we are today, is all the political parties determined to put missiles, hypersonic missiles, right on Russia's borders. And until you say stop the eastward movement of NATO, you'll get no way of solving the sanctions which are affecting the prices, particularly the food prices. They must be worth about 8 or 10% of this inflation. So there you have it. It is bad. It is worse than the government figures. It is getting worse. And none of the political parties in the UK are attempting to mention what is the major cause of, shall we say, of at least half of this inflation.
Said Purza, you talked about how you said not only in 2022 we saw obviously these strikes happening, but also that we are seeing that to also happen for this coming year. The information about the strikes, are they announced beforehand, and is that information coming from the unions mostly, or the ones that are organizing, I'm assuming, are the unions representing these people in different sectors that plan the strikes? And do you get a sense that when you say it's going to continue through 2023, sporadically or somewhat of on a continual basis, if you can tell that to us?
I think we're going to see almost a strike almost every day of the month in January at least. Beyond that, we'll still have to see. And yes, the process is what the unions do is that they put the call for strike or industrial action to their members. And once their members vote for the strike to go ahead, they will come out and announce it publicly with a date for everybody to know, and even locations where those picket lines will be formed. And that's how you know that there will be a strike. For example, on the 18th and 19th of January, we're going to see railway workers go back on strike. And there are other days as well when you will see teachers, when you will see postal workers, as well as highway maintenance workers, nurses. All of them will be striking during January. And I'm guessing beyond, because, as I say, the government has had months to settle this, the dispute with the different industrial sectors, and it hasn't been able to. The reason being, they're saying there is no money to throw at these different sectors to be able to meet their demands, and so they're going to have to accept what we're putting on the table, which is somewhere between 7 and 8. You say 5 and 7, any of those figures. But again, it's not meeting inflation. So looking at it, what we're looking at is these people are getting a pay cut and not a pay rise. And that's what they're really angry about. And it's not just about pay. It's about conditions. There's about the issue of pensions, redundancies, for example, what the RMT, the railway union, led by Mick Lynch, whom the government has been trying to make out as Mick the Grinch, the guy who stole Christmas. You can see where the government is headed, what it's trying to do. What they're trying to do is to prevent some of the redundancies that will take place. For example, the guards that help people get on and out of trains, or to make sure that nothing happens to them. These people are looking at losing their jobs, and that's what the RMT, above everything else, at the same time as everything else, is trying to protect, to keep these people in their jobs. So to your question about how do we know or whether or not these strikes will be taking place, that's how we do, and it's all out there. It's public knowledge with dates and days of when they're going to happen, the hours and locations where those strikes will be taking place, Governor.
Okay, thank you. Last question, Rodney Shakespeare. What is the worst case scenario we're looking at here? I mean, I read one headline that said the UK may be entering the lost decade, and made a comparison to what happened to Japan in the 1990s. And it then cited some very negative economic indicators. I'm looking at wages to have fallen actually for the month of November based on one particular source. So not solution, but is the UK looking at that being a possible scenario if things continue to head the wrong direction?
We are looking at all these bad scenarios. And there is even talk that we're going to have another Conservative Prime Minister. A new Conservative Prime Minister, it will make no difference, because all the main political parties in the UK are mentally paralyzed. They will not address the issue, which the biggest factor in this inflation causing all the trouble are in fact the sanctions on Russia. And that situation will not be resolved until the West says they will stop the movement of NATO to the east. It's an outrage. Hypersonic missiles could wipe out Russia just like that. The West won't tolerate missiles in Cuba 60 years ago, and here are we proposing missiles right against to wipe out Moscow 60 years later. The people must wake up and demand that the political parties start addressing reality. Unfortunately, they're not doing this at all.
Thank you very much for that. Rodney Shakespeare, Professor of Economics. Saidpur, is our pleasure. Of course, one of them from London. Both from London, talking to us there. And that does it for this news review. Thanks for tuning in.